The letter found her at a line camp outside Cheyenne, folded into an envelope gone soft and gray from weeks of travel, and she read it twice by the light of a dying fire before she let herself believe the words on the page. 10 days, the county clerk had written, in a hand so careful it seemed almost apologetic. 10 days to file, 10 days to occupy, or the claim would pass to whoever else stood waiting with paper in hand. She had folded the letter along its old creases and tucked it inside her shirt, against her ribs, as though the warmth of her own body might keep it from being some cruel trick of fate. She owned little enough to make the leaving easy: a saddle worn soft in the seat, a bedroll patched twice at the corner, and Willow, the bay mare who had carried her through 6 years of other men's cattle and other men's fences, never once her own. She had broken horses for wages that barely covered flour and coffee, had strung wire until her palms went hard as harness leather, had slept in bunkhouses where the other hands eyed her sideways until her work spoke plainer than her sex ever could. She had never expected to own a blade of grass in this world, and now, riding south through the long gold light of a Wyoming autumn, she turned over in her mind the name of an uncle she had met perhaps twice in her life, a man called Walter Dawson, who had died, leaving her a ranch she had never seen. The road to Red Rock unspooled slow and dusty beneath Willow's hooves, past cottonwoods gone brittle with the seasons turning, past ranches fat with cattle, and ranches gone quiet with failure, and Maggie could not yet tell which kind waited for her at the end of the trail. The county recorder's office sat squat and sun-bleached at the edge of town, its windows filmed with the same fine dust that coated everything in that country, and it was there, standing before a woman with steel-gray hair and a ledger open on the counter between them, that the shape of her trouble became clear. 10 days, the recorder said again, tapping the page with one blunt finger, from the date this letter was posted, not from today. You understand what that means, Miss Dawson. It means I've already lost 3 of them getting here. It means you have 7 left to file the claim proper, and to show the lands being worked, occupied, not just visited. The woman's eyes were not unkind, but they carried the weariness of someone who had watched hope curdle into loss before. There's another party with interest in Juniper Creek. A buyer from town. He's been asking after the property since before your uncle was cold in the ground. Maggie felt the words settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward long after the surface had gone quiet again. The ride back from town took the better part of an afternoon, and she spent it watching the count in her head the way a woman might watch a wound to see whether it bled fresh or had begun, mercifully, to close. 7 days. She turned the number over like a stone worn smooth from handling, and by the time the ranch house rose up out of the heat shimmer ahead of her, weathered gray and patient against the red hills, the number had not grown any kinder. She unsaddled the mare herself, working the cinch loose with hands that had done the same motion 10,000 times on other men's land, and then she walked the property the way she had been taught to walk any unfamiliar range. Slowly, eyes low, reading the ground before she trusted her eyes higher up. The corrals stood empty, their rails silvered by weather but sound enough, waiting the way a chair waits for someone who has stopped coming to supper. The lower pasture rolled out green and deep beneath the afternoon light, grass enough to fatten a herd twice the size of any her uncle had once run, and still there was nothing in it. No hoofprint pressed fresh into the mud along the creek, no dung drying pale in the sun, no low of an animal calling for water or company, only the wind moving through grass that had grown tall and untroubled for want of anything to graze it down. She walked the fence line until dusk began to pool blue and heavy in the low places, the way dusk did in that country, settling first into the canyons and the draws before it climbed to claim the open ground. And everywhere she looked, she found the same silence confirmed. No cattle in the near range. No cattle on the far slopes where the land broke up into red rock and juniper. Nothing. The neighboring ranchers, when she rode to ask, told her the same story in nearly the same words, as though it had been agreed upon somewhere before she arrived and simply handed down to her like a worn coat that no longer fit anyone, but was too practical to throw away. Her uncle had sold his herd off during the dry years, they said. Hard seasons, thin grass, prices gone soft. A man makes peace with a herd he can no longer feed. He had withdrawn from the business after that, quiet and private, keeping to himself until his heart gave out one winter morning with no one there to notice for 2 days. A sad story, they agreed, shaking their heads with the particular sympathy reserved for the dead and the misfortunes that could no longer be argued with. Most of them, kindly enough, suggested she sell quickly before the deadline turned her inheritance into nothing at all but taxes and regret. She thanked them and said little else, and rode home in the dark with the count in her chest ticking down like a clock she could hear but could not see, wondering why a barn built to hold gear so carefully organized should belong to a man who had given up everything it was meant for. 9 days remained now, though she did not need the letter from the county clerk to tell her so. She carried the number the way a person carries a bruise, aware of it with every small shift of weight. Every hour the sun climbed and fell. She rose before light the next morning and went to the barn first, not the house, because the house held only silence, and the smell of dust settled too long over furniture no one had touched, while the barn at least held the shape of work once done, and work was the only language she had ever fully trusted. The tack room sat at the far end, past the empty stalls that still smelled faintly of horse and leather, rather than the mildew and rot she might have expected from a place left 3 years to rot. She pushed the door open on a hinge that did not so much as whine, oiled, she realized, and recently, and stood a long moment simply looking. Bridles hung in even rows on their pegs, each one cleaned and mended where the leather had begun to crack, the bits free of rust. Coiled ropes sat stacked by size on a shelf, built for exactly that purpose. A blacksmith's rasp and a set of nippers lay wrapped in oilcloth beside a stack of horseshoes graded by hoof size, the kind of order a man kept only if he expected, someday soon, to need every piece of it again. She turned slowly, counting saddle pads, tallying halters, and the counting itself began to trouble her more than any single object, because abandonment left behind chaos or absence, not this careful, patient arrangement, as though the ranch were merely resting between one season and the next, rather than closed up and forgotten. It was the map that stopped her breath. It hung on the back wall behind a hanging blanket she nearly overlooked, a large hand-drawn survey of the ranch and the country beyond it, inked in her uncle's careful hand, the boundary lines she expected to find, the creek, the lower pasture, the house marked with a small square. But past the drawn boundary, past the line that should have ended the map's concern entirely, faint pencil marks continued on, so light she had to tilt the paper toward the window to be certain they were not some trick of the grain in the wood beneath the glass. The marks wound upward through what looked like broken country, gullies and switchbacks sketched thin and hesitant, climbing toward a place labeled Sagebrush Divide, and beyond that, at the very edge of the page, 2 words written smaller than the rest, as if the hand that made them had wanted them found only by someone willing to look closely enough to deserve them. North Bowl. She stood with her thumb pressed against the words a long while, feeling the barn settle around her in the cooling morning air, and somewhere far off, though she told herself it was only the wind moving through the pines, she thought she heard something low and long and almost like a bawling calf. She folded the map along its old creases with the care one gives to something that has already survived more than it should have, and she carried it out into the light, where the day had begun to lean toward noon, without her noticing the hours slipping past. 8 days now standing between her and the county's patients, though the number felt smaller each time she let herself think of it. She saddled the mare and rode the fence line east, because a fence tells a rancher what a house cannot, and because Walter's pencil marks had unsettled something in her that wanted answering with her own eyes rather than another man's memory. The posts along the near boundary were ordinary enough, gray cedar gone silver with weather, the wire sagging in places but sound where it mattered. She rode an hour before she found the first one that was not ordinary at all. It stood no different in height or wood from its neighbors, but low near the base, where a careless glance would never fall. Someone had carved a mark into the grain and let the years darken it until it looked almost like part of the tree's own scarring. A half circle, and beneath it a single straight line, cut clean and deliberate. She sat the mare a long moment, studying it, running the shape of it against every brand she had ever known from her years drifting one outfit to the next, and found nothing that matched. It was not the Dawson iron, it was not any brand registered, so far as she knew, to the ranches bordering Juniper Creek. She rode on and found the mark again 3 posts later, and again beyond that, spaced with the patience of a man who had meant the marking to be found only by someone walking the line slowly, the way she was walking it now, and not by someone passing at a trot with their mind on supper. By the time the light began to slant gold and long across the grass, she had counted the symbol 9 times, always on posts beyond what she understood to be the ranch's true edge, and always facing outward, toward the broken red country climbing to Sagebrush Divide. She turned the mare for home with more questions than she had carried out that morning, and no answers riding home beside her, but the tired good sense of her own horse. That night she sat up later than she meant to. The lamp burned low, the ledger and the map spread before her on the kitchen table, and she told herself she was only tired, that the ranch's silence was working on her nerves, the way silence will on anyone sleeping alone in a house too large for one person's breathing. But when the wind shifted and came down off the ridge behind the barn, it carried with it a sound she knew in her bones before her mind had finished arguing against it. Low, drawn out, unmistakable even at that distance. Cattle. Somewhere far beyond the fence her uncle had built, cattle were lowing in the dark, and no one had told her they were there. She did not sleep so much as she waited for morning, inside a body pretending to rest, and when the dark outside the window finally thinned to the color of weak tea, she was already dressed, already moving, already counting the days left to her, the way a person counts coins they fear will not be enough. 8 now. 8 days until the county's patience ran out, and Silas Granger's papers, whatever they truly said, would have the weight of a claim uncontested. She saddled the mare in the blue hour before sunrise, her breath showing white, her hands sure despite the cold, and she told herself that whatever she found at the end of the pencil line on that tackroom map, she needed to find it before the light was fully up and burning off the morning's secrets. The trail off the ranch's marked boundary was no trail at all at first, only a suggestion of passage through sage and rabbit brush, but she had ridden enough broken country to read the ground the way other women read print, and she followed the faint scuffing of old hoof prints, half erased by wind, up through a dry wash that narrowed as it climbed. The red rock walls closed in on either side until Willow's shoulders nearly brushed stone, and the sky above became a blue ribbon pinched thin between the cliffs, and Maggie felt, not for the first time in her life but sharply now, how small a rider was against country that did not care whether she found what she was looking for. Then the gully bent, and a stand of juniper crowded close enough to hide what lay behind it, and she pushed the mare through the low branches with her arm raised against her face, and came out the other side into a valley that made her pull rein and simply sit, unable for a moment to do anything but look. Grass, tall and green, in a way nothing on the lower range had been, ran the length of a hidden bowl fed by a creek that caught the early light like poured silver, and scattered across that grass, unhurried, unafraid, lifting their heads at the sound of the mare's hooves, and then returning to grazing as though a rider were the least remarkable thing they had seen all season, were cattle. Dozens of them, more than dozens, red hides and roan, young stock grown heavy-shouldered and calm, older cows moving with the settled patience of animals that had never known hunger or drought or fear of the knife. She rode closer, her heart going hard against her ribs, and put her hand briefly to her mouth when she saw it plain on flank after flank, the Dawson brand, burned deep and honest, unmistakable even at a distance. Not sold, not scattered to pay debts, hidden, all of them, kept fed and watered, and alive in a valley no one in Red Rock believed existed, while the whole county whispered that Walter Dawson had failed. She counted them as best she could, riding the perimeter of the bowl at a slow walk, so as not to spook the herd into scattering across ground she did not yet know, and gave up somewhere past 60 head, understanding only that, whatever the county believed about Juniper Creek's failure, the truth grazing before her told a different story entirely. The sun climbed higher over the rim of red rock as she rode, and the cattle parted for Willow's passing the way cattle do for a horse they have learned to trust, unbothered, incurious, which told her plainer than any brand that someone had been coming here regularly, speaking to them, feeding them, making them gentle, not abandoned stock gone wild on forgotten range. Tended stock, loved, in the particular rough way a rancher loves what keeps his family fed. At the far end of the valley, tucked against a shoulder of stone that broke the wind, stood the line shack she had glimpsed from the pass, small, sound-roofed, its door hung true on leather hinges that did not so much as creak when she pushed it open. Inside she found a wood stove blacked with recent use, a shelf of salt blocks, coils of rope, tools for doctoring hooves, and on a rough table beneath the single window, a ledger book bound in oilcloth that she knew before she touched it belonged to her uncle. She sat on the edge of the narrow bunk to read it, because her legs did not seem willing to hold her standing, and the hand inside was cramped and careful, a man writing by lamplight who meant every word to last. He had written of the dry years first, of the Barquet and the Sawtooth outfits riding over under the pretense of neighborly concern, offering to buy him out at a price that would not have covered the debt on his own barn, and how he had understood, watching them ride away satisfied, that they meant to starve him into selling rather than wait for drought to do it. So he had moved the good cattle by night and by twos and threes through the Red Rock Pass, rotating them so no single absence would be noticed from the road, and let the county believe what it wished to believe about a broken old man and a failed ranch, because a man thought finished was a man left alone. The last entry was dated only months before his death, the ink fainter, the hand less steady, and it said little beyond a single unfinished thought that she read 3 times before its meaning settled into her like cold water. that North Bowl was not the whole of what he had kept safe, that there was another place, higher and harder to find, that he called only the East Meadow, and that he had run out of paper, or strength, or time, before he could say where. She closed the journal slowly, the way one might close the eyes of something that had finally been allowed to rest, and sat a long while in the dim shack, with the smell of old smoke and salt blocks around her, counting on her fingers the days that remained the way a woman counts coins she cannot afford to lose. 7 now. 7 days before the recorder's window shut like a door with no handle on the far side, and whatever lay unclaimed would belong, by the plain, cold language of the law, to whoever stood loudest in the yard when it closed. She could not spend those days chasing a phrase written by a dying man's failing hand. And yet she could not put it down either, for a rancher who buried one herd to save it from wolves in men's clothing was not a rancher who would leave a second treasure to chance, and something in her, some inherited stubbornness she had not known she carried until she rode through the Red Rock Pass, told her that Walter Dawson did not waste ink on things that did not matter. So she worked the days forward, the only way a person can, one animal at a time. She cut the herd into small bands and pushed them down through the pass at dawn and dusk, the hours when the light was kind and the cattle least likely to bawl their presence to anyone watching from the road, and she felt the old rhythm of it settle into her shoulders like a garment she had only just remembered owning, the low whistle, the patient pressure of Willow's shoulder against a reluctant flank, the dust rising gold and then gray as the sun climbed and fell. Each evening the home pasture held a few more head than it had that morning, and each evening the lower fields looked a little less like a ranch pretending to be finished, and a little more like one remembering what it was. But it was Willow who would not let the matter rest. Every night, unsaddled and rubbed down and turned loose in the yard, the mare walked the same slow circle toward the eastern fence line and stood with her ears pricked and her head lifted toward the darkening hills, nickering low into the wind, as though calling to something just out of hearing, and every night she resisted being led back to the barn a moment longer than the night before. Maggie noticed it the second evening and dismissed it. She noticed it the third and stood beside the mare in the cooling dark, following the line of her gaze toward the ridge where the cottonwoods bent gray and skeletal against the last light. By the fourth night she no longer dismissed anything. A horse did not call toward empty country. A horse called toward horses. She stood at the fence long after the stars had come hard and close, one hand resting on Willow's warm neck, feeling the mare's attention pull steady and unbroken toward the east, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in darkness, that tomorrow she would follow where the mare was already trying to lead her. 6 days remained, though she did not let herself count them that morning, not with the sky still holding its breath before dawn, and the cottonwoods standing black against a horizon, just beginning to gray at its seam. She saddled the mare in silence, working by feel more than sight, and led her out through the yard gate before the rooster had found reason to crow, and Willow, sensing purpose at last after 4 nights of frustrated calling, walked with an eagerness that made the bit ring soft against her teeth. The trail, when it revealed itself, was no trail at all but a suggestion of one, a narrowing between 2 shoulders of pale stone, half swallowed by chokecherry and wind-bent grass, the kind of path a man might walk 100 times and still call nothing but a deer run. Maggie dismounted and led Willow through on foot, ducking beneath low branches silvered with early light, and felt the ground begin to fall away beneath her boots in a long, easy slope that no map in the tack room had ever troubled to mark. The grove opened without warning, the way a held breath opens into speech, and she stood at its edge with one hand still closed around the rein and looked down into a basin she had not known existed, a low bowl of country ringed by broken stone, its floor thick with grass gone gold and green together, wildflowers scattered through it like something scattered by hand rather than by chance. And there, unhurried, unafraid, moving through the tall grass with the loose grace of animals that had never known want, were horses. She counted them without meaning to. 2 heavy-boned geldings, work-marked and patient-eyed, grazing shoulder to shoulder near a seep of water. A trio of older saddle horses, one graying at the muzzle, watching her with mild curiosity but no alarm, as though visitors were rare but not unwelcome. And apart from these, near the stone wall at the basin's far side, 3 young horses stood together in a loose knot, barely more than colts by the look of their unworked mouths and unscarred flanks, wild-eyed in the particular way of stock that had never felt a hand close over a lead rope. Willow nickered again, softer now, satisfied, and one of the older mares lifted her head and answered in kind, and the sound carried across the basin like a greeting long overdue. Maggie walked the fence line of stacked stone slowly, understanding growing in her the way morning light grows across a valley floor, not all at once, but steadily, until there was no shadow left to doubt it. A small shed stood tucked against the rock, weathered but sound, and inside she found tack oiled against the damp, horse blankets folded with a careful hand, and a second set of notes, tucked beneath a tin of nails, written in the same slanting script that had led her to North Bowl. She did not read them yet. She stood instead among the grass and the grazing horses and the low morning light, and understood that her uncle had not simply hidden a herd to save it. He had been building something. She read the notes that evening, by lamplight, with the shed's oiled tack still smelling faintly of neatsfoot on her hands, and understood at last what her uncle had meant when he wrote of building rather than merely hiding. But there was no time that night to sit long with the wonder of it, for the calendar nailed above the kitchen door had grown thin with days crossed through, and what remained of the 10 counted out by the county's clerk had narrowed to a handful, close enough now that she could feel the pressure of it, the way a person feels weather coming before the sky ever changes color. It was into that narrowing that Silas Granger rode the following afternoon, his horse groomed to a shine that seemed almost an insult to the dust of the yard, his hat set at an angle that suggested a man accustomed to being received rather than merely tolerated. He carried a leather folder under one arm, and he carried also the particular patience of a man who believed time was working for him, which it was, or so he still believed. "I've had my lawyer draw up the particulars," he said, laying the folder open across the porch rail, without being asked to sit, without being offered so much as water. "Your uncle and I had an understanding, going back some years. I'd hate to see it complicated by sentiment." Maggie did not touch the papers. She stood with her arms loose at her sides, the posture of a woman who had spent years learning not to flinch at another person's confidence, and let the silence stretch until he was the one obliged to fill it. "Fine grazing country, they tell me, up past the ridge line," he said then, and his eyes moved past her shoulder toward the hills, toward Sagebrush Divide, toward country he had no honest reason to know existed at all. Water's the real question in this district. A man wonders where a place like this keeps its water, this time of year, with no herd drinking it down. "The spring holds," she said, plain as a closed gate, and offered nothing further, though something cold moved through her at the ease with which he had asked it, as though he were feeling along a wall in the dark, for a door he already suspected was there. He smiled, the smile of a man filing away an answer for later use, and gathered his folder, and told her he would return before the week's end, when the county's patience, he said, would have run its course, regardless of what either of them wished. He rode out unhurried, the way a man rides who believes the clock is doing his work for him, and Maggie stood watching the dust of him settle long after he had gone, counting days now the way another woman might count breaths, before diving under dark water. 6 days remained now, by her own reckoning, chalked in charcoal on the barn's inner wall, and she went into the house that evening with the particular quiet of a woman who has decided to stop waiting for answers, to arrive on their own. Walter's desk stood where it had always stood, beneath the window that looked east toward the hills, its surface scarred by decades of ink and elbow, and she had searched it once already in the ordinary way, the way a person searches a drawer for a missing letter, and found nothing but seed receipts and a broken pocket knife. But the visitor's questions had settled in her like grit under a saddle blanket, chafing at something she could not yet name, and she found herself running her hand along the desk's lower edge, the way she might check a horse's leg for heat, feeling for what should not be there. The false bottom revealed itself not to sight, but to sound, a hollow answer where solid wood should have spoken, and when she pried it loose with the broken knife her uncle had left for exactly such patient hands, the lamplight fell across a sealed envelope and a folded map gone soft as cloth at its creases. The envelope bore no name beyond a single line of careful script. To the one who keeps Juniper Creek whole. She sat with it a long while before opening it, the house holding its breath around her, the clock in the front room ticking off the same days she had been counting on the barn wall. When she finally broke the seal, she found her uncle's hand again, steadier here than in the line shack journal, a man writing with purpose rather than merely to keep himself company in the dark. He wrote of pressure applied years before her arrival, of Granger and 2 wealthier men whose names she recognized from county gossip, men who had wanted Juniper Creek cheap and had spread word that it was failing, hoping the failing would become fact if repeated often enough. He wrote that he had refused and hidden what he could not defend outright, and waited for someone who would not simply inherit the land, but stand on it. The map beneath the letter was no sketch. It was a true survey, stamped and signed, showing North Bowl and the Eastern Basin drawn plainly within the ranch's boundary, filed, so the notation read, years before, and forgotten by everyone but the man who had drawn it. Maggie sat very still, the lamp guttering low, understanding now why Granger had asked about water with such patient hunger, and understanding, too, that 6 days was no longer enough time to feel afraid. The nights that followed passed the way water moves through a narrow channel, quick, relentless, impossible to hold back by wishing. She worked from the gray edge of dawn until the lamp burned low again, driving the cattle down in careful stages so the grass would not be stripped and the animals would not founder on the trail, gentling the young horses just enough that they would lead without panic, mending fence line by line as though each post driven true were an argument she was making to no one but herself. The days fell away one after another, and each one she crossed off the barn wall felt less like marking time and more like watching a rope pay out toward its end. By the 9th day, the lower pasture held more cattle than the county had believed existed on the whole of Juniper Creek, and the corrals, though rough, would hold. But holding cattle was not the same as holding a claim, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a person who has run out of room to be careless, that none of it would matter unless paper answered paper. She left before first light, the deed map and the sealed letter wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, and rode harder than she had ever asked Willow to ride, the mare's breath coming ragged by the time the buildings of the town rose pale and low against the morning. She did not stop at the boardwalk to explain herself to anyone who might be watching from behind a store window. She went straight to the recorder's office and set the papers on the counter before she had fully caught her own breath. The recorder took her time, as she always did, unfolding the survey with the flat, unhurried patience of a woman who had learned long ago that haste made mistakes, and mistakes made lawsuits. She traced the boundary lines with one finger, then stopped and looked up. "This was filed," she said. "Years back. I remember the ink, if not the name attached to it. Nobody thought the upper country was worth surveying, so nobody thought to look for it again." "Then it's real," Maggie said. "It was always real." "It was always yours," the recorder answered, and there was no triumph in it, only the plain satisfaction of a record finally matching the truth it had been keeping quiet all along. She reached for her stamp, then paused, glancing at the clock on the wall as if to measure what remained of the day against what still needed doing, and said, "You'd best not wait on ceremony. Bring what proves you're using the land. All of it. Today, if you can." So she rode back through the streets of Red Rock with the stamped survey folded against her chest, like something that might still get away from her if she let it breathe too much air, and she gathered what proof she could in the last light of the 10th day: Willow's bridle, a tally sheet of counted heads, the journal in her uncle's own hand, and brought it all before the recorder just as the courthouse clock leaned toward closing. She was still setting the last paper down when the door opened behind her and the polished buyer came in with his own sheaf of documents raised like a hand about to be played, and stopped because the recorder was already lifting her stamp, and the sound it made against the survey was small and final and could not be taken back. "You're too late," the recorder told him, not unkindly, only the way a woman states the hour when she is asked. "This land was surveyed and filed years ago. It was never abandoned. It was only waiting on someone willing to prove it." He looked at Maggie then, and whatever calculation had carried him this far seemed to leave his face all at once, so that what remained was only a man who had misjudged both a dead rancher and his heir, and had nothing left to say that would change the ink already dried on the page. Word traveled the way it always did in a small town, faster than any rider, so that by the time Maggie came back up the road to Juniper Creek, there were a few neighbors gathered loose in the yard, the same ones who had once told her to sell and go, standing now with their hats in their hands, as though the ranch itself commanded a little more respect, with cattle lowing behind the barn and horses moving in the corral. She did not make them a speech. She only took the sealed letter from her coat, unfolded it in the low gold light, and read her uncle's words aloud, that he had not chosen the nearest relative but the right one, that he had watched her name travel through cattle camps and horse yards long before she ever knew he was watching, that he had trusted her to keep the land whole because she had already shown him, without knowing it, that she could. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment, and the silence held something like reverence in it, the particular quiet of people revising what they believed. Maggie folded the letter away, looked out over the pasture where her uncle's herd grazed easy in the dusk, and understood that the ranch was not something she had merely survived into owning, but something she had, in the plainest sense, earned, and that she meant to keep it open and whole and hers for as long as the land would have